Hey, everybody. Welcome and thank you for popping in to this webinar. And this is Building Applications with Azure, Part 1. I'll talk about that and kind of why it's Part 1 and what all that means. And hopefully there'll be a really cool Part 2, which you could potentially have some say in. Anyways, just want to let you know I'm Tracy Wallace. And if you've not been to INE in the last year or so, I'm the Director of Content for Microsoft at INE. I am particularly focused on the Azure environment, and I've been dying to get to a point where I get to play around with a little bit of dev. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. And in fact, let's just jump right in and kind of take a look at what we're going to be covering. Most of this webinar is going to be really based on a demonstration. And the demonstration is going to be kind of what I would call a cooking show demo demonstration, where you're not going to watch me type out a bunch of code. We're not going to go all, movie hacker and watch me type really fast. I've already got a couple solutions, but I'm going to show you kind of the whole process and setting things up. Anyways, I want to start out talking about cloud service options. You know, if you are moving to the cloud, if you're already in the cloud, what are your options for hosting your workload there? And then I'm going to go through some of the different categories of features that are available specifically in Azure. Now, just so you know, I'm an Azure person, but realistically, all the cloud providers are going to have platform services that are at least similar to what I'm going to go through here. But of course, you know, as a Microsoft focused instructor, I'd love to see you go take a look at some of the stuff in Microsoft. All right, so we'll take a look at demonstrating the database functionality then, and I'm also going to bring up a function app and show you kind of how you can create and deploy function apps. Also take a look at web apps, how those can be created and deployed. And finally, if we have time, and I think we probably will, I want to go ahead and demonstrate a way that we can increase the security of our applications by using Key Vault. And I just realized I forgot to tear that back down. So I'll really quickly tear that back down at the beginning of the demonstration. Okay, so without further ado, I actually want to start out talking about the cloud architecture. And what we have with this slide is we really have two different examples of frankly the same thing. Okay, so we've got an on-premises stack and a cloud stack. And it doesn't really matter what your stack is. You're going to have a physical facility, whether you're running this in your own premises or not. There's going to be things like networking and routers and switches and hubs and power. You are likely running a virtualization platform, and you can see that these things are really, it doesn't matter whether you're running this in the cloud or you're running it on premises. All of these things lead up to whatever your workload is, to your application, right? And again, to me, what's really key to the cloud is you're not changing that application workload, right? What you're doing is you're saying, okay, we really just want a different way that we can host that. And that's really, when it comes down to it, where cloud comes in, because the cloud is going to take care of, and again, I'm saying the cloud, this certainly is Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Services, IBM's cloud, whatever cloud you're going with, they're all kind of doing the same thing here, that, those lower level things up through the virtualization, that's just being handled for you, right? And so those are things that you're not responsible for, your company's not responsible for, you're paying for them, of course, but they're not, if you will, on you, okay? Now, they do add in a management plane, right? Which is how you interact, how your organization interacts with the cloud. Right? If you're going to provision a virtual machine, or you're going to provision a network or a web application or a database, you're really going through that management plane. And one level of cloud development is working specifically with that management plane, doing things to automate the process, to integrate that process. But that's honestly not what we're going to talk about, because I don't think that's where the vast majority of developers would get any value out of, or much value out of the cloud. It's very cool stuff, right? But unless you're planning on being kind of a cloud provider or reseller, or you are in DevNet or DevOps possibly, then it's really not the level you're going to look at. And so really the level that you're going to look at is that top part of this diagram. Okay, so if you think about you're an application developer, let's say you're writing a web application. Okay, that web application is your workload, but it's got to run somewhere, right? And so if it's a web application, it's probably running on some services. Maybe it's running on Apache or Nginx or IIS, right? And that's running somewhere. It's running on a virtual machine. And all of these things need to be present. It doesn't matter how or where you're running it. These things are going to be present. What matters, though, is, and what differentiates is where you're actually going to be responsible for this. And really, you could kind of be responsible at any of these levels in the cloud. For example, you might say, okay, we've got this, again, let's just take the simple example of a web application. Okay, and it doesn't have to be. It could be any sort of application that can run in your network, that can run over TCP/IP. And we say, okay, we currently have this running on a virtual machine in our data center. We want to move this virtual machine over and run it in the cloud. We want to run it in Azure. All right. Well, what that does is it says, look, if I'm going to run that virtual machine, then I'm going to use all of the infrastructure below that as a service. And that's actually what it's called. It's called infrastructure as a service. But I'm going to be responsible for that virtual machine and above. Okay, now you can go another level, and frankly, this is where I like to live, and that is platform as a service. And that says, look, I have this workload. We have this custom workload. We have this website, this web application. It's written, whether it's in Node.js or Ruby or my personal language of preference, which is .NET, or platform of preference, which is .NET. And look, what we really care about is our workload. And we know it has to be hosted, but we don't want to deal with any of that. We want to really focus just on getting done what we want. And frankly, if you will, rent out the service of managing, the IIS, the Nginx, the Apache, or whatever it is that I need, right? Or maybe even Kubernetes, as it were, and as a container-based solution. But the point is, that is typically referred to as platform as a solution. Now, there is another hosting level, which is software as a service, another cloud provider level. And that's where the cloud provider actually is running everything. And in fact, that's actually what we're using right now. Okay, so I'm running this webinar through Zoom. Zoom is software as a service, right? We contract with Zoom, and Zoom says, okay, you can use all of our application, our workload, and you can do what you need to do with it, right? Microsoft 365, Google G Suite, Salesforce, all of these things are examples of software as a service. Now, as you kind of traverse these three different levels, and these are pretty standard definitions, and it can be a little fuzzy in between. In fact, Microsoft, for example, has a lot of what I like to call quasi-platform as a service offerings, where they're kind of platform as a service, but they're kind of infrastructure as a service as well. But generally speaking, right, as you kind of go down to the bottom of that, you get more control, right? So if you're running infrastructure as a service, you have a virtual machine, that means you're going to control the configuration of the operating system, the configuration of any services that are required to run your workload, as well as the workload itself, right? Whereas if you go all the way to the top, we're using Zoom, and Zoom is kind of what Zoom is, right? We don't have any control of their servers or anything else. Now, of course, what that does mean is we go up the level, it's going to be a lot more ease of administration, a lot of things that you don't have to worry about. You're just worrying about your workload. Now, as far as for me, where the key developer story really is right here. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to talk about this platform as a service. Right? So how can we go and look and frankly make our lives easier by taking our workloads, by taking the applications that we've built and allowing them to be hosted in the cloud, and in the case of this, in Azure, right? And so it's really kind of big picture where we're going with this. And what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the services that are available to you. And these are all platform services. So in other words, these are all things that are there, and they're there to make your life as a developer easier. Now, don't get me wrong, they're not all free. Some of them are, but you're going to pay for some of them. But that's same thing as buying a library, right? All right, so I've got 4 different areas, and this is not by any stretch fully encompassing of every platform service that's available within the Azure environment for you. And again, of course, if you're looking at AWS or Google Cloud Services, they're going to have similar things, slightly different, right? But this is what we've got in the Azure environment. Now, I'll also tell you that the order here is probably because the last learning path that I developed was for INE was the security learning path, the Microsoft certified, was it Azure Security Engineer Associate learning path. So those are kind of still top of my mind. But anyways, that's not really the point. So what are some of these features? Okay, big picture, some of the key identity features that we've got in Azure is you've got Azure Active Directory. And this is probably, and I haven't looked at anything in the last few years, but it's reasonable to think this is still the case, the most used feature within Azure. And the reason for that is because in addition to being useful for Azure, Azure AD is useful for third-party cloud-based applications, such as one you might have heard of, the service formerly known as Office 365, now known as Microsoft 365. If you're using Microsoft 365, you are using Azure AD. What does Azure AD do? Well, 2 key things that it does: provides identity and authentication, right? So you're going to have users defined there. You're going to be able to authenticate the users. Now, I've been working in .NET since .NET came out, and I work other languages as well. I've got lots of gray hair. That's why I keep it short so you can't see it. But there's Fortran in my history, some Pascal. And I do other things as well, but .NET is really where I live. And one thing I want to point out, and the reason why I bring that up is because in the demonstrations, and I went back and forth a little bit on this, but in the demonstrations that I'm going to show you today, they're going to be C# demonstrations, and I'm using Visual Studio as my development environment. Please understand that the concepts that we're looking at are not unique to C#. They're not unique to the .NET environment. You can host a wide range of solutions. It's just, quite frankly, that I wanted to make sure, looking at putting together a Python web app, which I have done, but it's certainly not my forte. I didn't want to see you having me bang up against things that I had forgotten or was unsure of. So I just picked something nice and familiar to do as a demonstration environment. But again, by no means means it's the only environment that you can use these services with. Okay. Anyways, back to the story at hand. So I brought that up. And I started talking about that because when I first started writing .NET applications, I was working on a system, and we had to authenticate users. It was an authenticated system. And long story short, we basically had to build our own authentication system on top of .NET. And this was .NET. It was ASP.NET 1.0, maybe 2.0. Let's just say it wasn't easy, and I was never fully comfortable with it, right? I'd much rather allow a provider such as Azure that has a well-designed, well-tested, well-secured, lots of money behind just authentication and identity system, and that's really what Azure AD does. And I've got identity, authentication, but it also does things, more advanced things like multi-factor authentication, built-in capabilities, also some conditional access. I will say with both of these, there are cost factors associated with those. I can actually use Azure AD for free with some limitations, and it provides identity and authentication. But there's other services as well. There's also, at the application service level, it's pretty interesting. This one here, snap-in authentication. It's not its technical name, but it's kind of how I refer to it. And I can have an application that actually doesn't have any authentication. I can say, you know what? I need authenticated access, but I can't re-engineer my application. Well, you could actually go and host the application in an Azure application service or web app. And you can actually layer on top of that, without modifying the code of the application at all, some authentication, which I think is actually really an interesting concept. I will say, however, and I've taught this more times than I could count, I would never actually use it in practice, because if I'm authenticating someone, I probably want to be able to use their identity within my application as well. So I'm going to do that. Now, you technically can do that a little bit with this snap-in authentication, because when you authenticate, you get certain information that's actually passed as an environment variable, right? So you could pull things like the identity, base identity information in. So it's an interesting concept. It's not one that I think is necessarily super critical. Now, another thing, and I'm going to actually demonstrate this in the demonstrations that I do for this webinar, is key-based function app access. And I want to talk about function apps a little bit. I think function apps are a really interesting concept that are hosted within the Azure environment. And they can be secured in a variety of ways, including a pretty simple key-based access. In fact, there's a number of services in Azure that support key-based access. And so I have a function, I get an access key for that function, and I control that access key, and thus you can't just anonymously use one of my function apps. And we'll talk about function apps again in a moment. Now, another topic, and this would be a topic potentially for another day, it's actually a pretty massive topic, API management. There's actually an entire service for managing APIs, and it's actually really cool stuff. It's got its own identity system where I can allow developers in, actually I would say authorization system, where I can allow authors in, and I can allow authors specific or access to specific APIs. So that's outside of what we're going to talk about today, but I personally think it's a very cool capability. All right, so those are some of the identity options that we have. Now also, and again, this is probably a lot because I have been working on this, there are really a number of services that are available to us as developers that are security related. And I will tell you, that is one of the more important and also one of the more difficult things to build into an application. You always want to build for security, build for zero trust. But from my experience, in my opinion, the more you can leverage services, the better off you are. You may feel different, but there's a ton of these services. There's a couple services that are actually very similar, Application Gateway and Front Door. What both of these do is they allow you to control access to your, in this case, web-based applications. These are both what we call layer 7. They both provide firewall with something called the Web Application Firewall that has rules and even customizable rules now for many common attacks, things like cross-site scripting attacks, things like SQL injection attacks, and many more that you can just pretty much just say, okay, I have an application gateway. I want to put all my traffic through that. I want to set up the web application firewall with that and protect my application behind that environment. Now, if you've got a application load that's not strictly a web-based, there's also the Azure Firewall. That is a level 4 firewall that is a service, really simple as that. There is built-in DDoS protection. This is available as an option on the platform services such as web apps. You can also add it for if you're hosting your own virtual machines. And that's built in using Microsoft's own denial of service, distributed denial of service protection. One of the things that I think is absolutely key new features from a security standpoint is service endpoints. Let's say, for example, that you've got a MySQL database and it's supporting a web application, but honestly, you don't want to have to incur the administrative overhead of standing up a virtual machine, installing and managing MySQL on that virtual machine, and then having your database on top of it. It's a simple database. It's just a MySQL database, easy to work with. And so to avoid all of that, you could create a Azure database for MySQL. Let Azure manage all of that underlying stuff. However, you want to make sure that you control access to it. And that's really what service endpoints do. They allow you to very tightly control access to your platform features. So things like databases, storage accounts, tons of other things. I know that's not very technical, but most anything now that you're going to connect up to that's at that platform level has the ability to set up service endpoints, which again gives you really tight control over what's accessing it. Key Vault is one of those, well, I hate using the phrase key services for security. It lets you securely store certificates, keys, and secrets. And you have tight access control to that through policy. You also have full auditing of access to that. And you're separating out, I think most importantly, your sensitive data like connection strings and that kind of information from the actual workload itself. Okay. And another thing that's really cool and kind of ties in to all of this and really ties into hosting in general is managed identity, right? And one of the issues, and this may or may not be true for you, but one of the issues I've always run into that always makes me cringe a little bit from a security standpoint is connection strings, right? And I've got to connect up to an Azure SQL database or a SQL Server database in general. I have a web app that's doing that. And realistically, I have to set up a SQL user, and I have to, somewhere embed that username and password in a connection string. And no matter how securely I store that connection string, I'm not comfortable with that. Well, now within Azure, we have this concept of managed identity where my service can actually have its own identity. And that's an Azure AD identity. And for services that support Azure AD authentication, such as it happens, an Azure SQL database, I can actually allow my application access to that service without embedding anywhere any kind of key or secret or password, right? It just says, okay, I'm running my web app. I'm running my website on a web app. The web app has an identity. I've given the identity access to my Azure SQL database, and now I don't have to embed a password, etc. Very cool stuff. For me, it's simple. And actually, you're going to see an example of this in terms of my code in .NET. I have to add one line of code, and then I can take advantage of that. All right. Now, what about the actual services, right? I'm 26 minutes in, haven't even gotten to the services. That's kind of the easy part. This is frankly kind of what you would expect, right? Say, okay, I'm a developer. I'm creating this application. I've got a weekend to do it. I don't have time to spin up my data storage and relational data and non-relational data help, right? And that's where we've got again, I hate to use such technical terms, but we have a ton of options that are platform level options within the Azure environment. As you can see right now, there's 4 different relational database systems that you can set up as platform as a service. SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB. Each of those can be available. So if you've got an application right now that's using MySQL, there's a very good chance. I always say very good chance because until you test it, you never know. There might be slight differences, but there's a very good chance you could take that, script it out, port it, use a tool that's used to port data from different MySQL machines, and just move that up into Azure and have that run and not have to worry about the underlying operating system and MySQL itself, because that's all going to be managed by Azure. Now, there's also a number of non-relational systems. If you're not familiar with Azure, you may not have heard of Cosmos DB. If you are familiar with Azure, it's pretty likely you have. This is really their premier non-relational NoSQL platform. It actually supports a number of APIs, including document-based. They have their own, which is called the SQL API. If you use MongoDB, that's supported. It also supports Spark now. Gremlin, which is an object-based storage, etcd, which is actually behind a lot of things as a storage mechanism. Cassandra, and also tabular storage. These are all different types of storage. I said Gremlin, I'm sorry, that's a graph API, not an object API, graph database. But it just gives you a wide variety of ways that you can store your data. On the messaging-based services, love queue-based applications when I'm building large-scale applications that need to be able to scale independently and be very resilient. Love having good, resilient messaging systems behind that. There's actually a number of them. You actually can have messages, message queues in a storage account. There's something called Service Bus. There's actually things built specifically for very large scale IoT and Internet of Things. There's something called Event Hub, and there's even a more sophisticated version of that called IoT Hub, and there's even more sophisticated IoT capabilities. But it's actually pretty cool. So, you know, I've got a, let's say a transportation company, a delivery company. I've got transponders on all my trucks and I need to track where packages are. That's a tremendous amount of data that's coming in continuously. And that's where message-based systems such as IoT Hub can be very useful because, again, you're not having to build that. There's other services as well. That's kind of a catch-all, but there are many other services. There's Azure Synapse. There's Data Factory, which is really an ETL kind of solution in the cloud-based. I would kind of put logic apps in there, which are really kind of workflow apps that you can define. And oh, I was about to say things like bot services. So if you want to create a chat bot, tons of machine learning and cognitive services, right? So you're not reinventing the wheel. All right, but we're not really going to deal with any of those. Those are way past what we're going to talk about in this. Then what about your workload itself? And really that's the most important thing, right? But it's also kind of the most straightforward. There's a number of ways that you can host workload. Again, obviously you can use virtual machines. You can use infrastructure as a service. If you've got a virtual machine running in your data center and you just want to migrate that into Azure, it's a good chance you could do that, right? And same thing for AWS or Google Cloud Services or whatever. Okay, but in terms of saying, okay, look, I just want to have my workload, I just want to host it. Web apps probably the most common. It's actually one of the things I'm going to demonstrate. Container services, love containerization. There's a wide range of container services available. Well, kind of 4 different options. One is there's a Kubernetes service, Azure Kubernetes service. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, it's really it's described different ways. For me, it's pretty simple. It's a massively scalable container service clustering system, which is kind of that was a little awkward, but that's what it is. And really not very easy to set up, but you can pretty much set it up just by clicking through a wizard, and you get yourself this very configurable and very scalable solution. For kind of one-offs, there's something called a container instance, where I can say, look, I've got a container, I just want the container to run, and I set it up. There's a container registry, and you can also go with a wide range of infrastructure solutions, virtual machines that you can run Docker or other solutions on. Function apps, you may have heard the term serverless compute. That is where you're not paying for capacity, you're paying for consumption, right? You may have also heard the term microservices, right? Where rather than building complete APIs, you're focusing on really individual API functions or calls. That's kind of what a function app is. It allows you to define independent functions that are going to be charged based on use, that are going to be potentially deployed as individual functions and can be even scaled completely independently. Okay, that's what a function app is, and I'm actually going to demonstrate a function app. You also have API management, mentioned that before, very cool stuff. It does go a bit beyond what I'm going to cover in this webinar. That would be a full webinar on its own. All right, now that's all the content stuff. There you go, half an hour. Now I've given myself a half an hour to go through a demonstration. So with my demonstration, I'm going to take a look at database hosting. I'm going to take a look at defining and hosting function apps. I'm going to take a look at web applications, and I'm also going to show you how you can use Key Vault. Okay, and I'm going to do all of that in half an hour. It may go a little long, but hey, if it goes a little long, you have to leave. Remember, it all gets recorded. Now, all of these demos are going to be based on a system that I put together. It's not actually what we use. The developers don't let me touch their stuff because anyways, here's what we have. Okay, I have an INE course information web app that I've defined. And that web app has a number of components. Okay, well, it has a web app. Okay, that web app delivers a web page. That web page has JavaScript that makes calls back to web API services hosted. Some terrible writing, but I've got web API services that are hosted in my web app. Now, those web API services are primarily pass-through. Actually, that's really what they are. The web API services connect up to function apps. Okay. And the reason why I don't have the JavaScript go directly is because I want to control access to my function apps. So I'm not sending any kind of key information or access information from my function apps over to the browser. That's all being handled on the back end. Okay. Now, the function app communicates with two systems. I've got some data in a SQL database, SQL Server database, and the function app is going to communicate with that. And the function app is also going to communicate with some data that's in Cosmos DB. Now, if you've never worked with Azure, you may not be familiar with Cosmos DB. Not really that important. If you worked with MongoDB before, what I'm doing is very similar. And again, I kind of thought about using the MongoDB API because I think that's on the one hand a little bit more probably generically familiar. On the other hand, it's not that critical. I will tell you that you can host a MongoDB API, and there is, as I said, a very good chance that if you've got code that currently goes against MongoDB, that you'd be able to use that code with very little to no change if you're hosting it in Cosmos DB. You just wouldn't be responsible for that MongoDB. And I know there's other cloud providers that actually just have a hosted MongoDB. It's the same thing. It's just kind of under the Cosmos DB umbrella. Okay. Now, in both cases, I need to authenticate. Okay. In the case of SQL, I'm going to use what's called a managed identity. I'm going to set up my function app with a managed identity. So it's going to have an Azure AD identity, and I'm going to give that identity access to my database. Now, I will tell you, because this is, I didn't want to go too deep into it, I'm doing it a really bad and lazy way, in that I'm giving the managed identity full administrative access. You would never do this, okay? But it just keeps me from having to go through the details. I didn't know if in a kind of part one dev class, people would like to see me bang out T-SQL script to set things up right. So I set it up easy. Now, in terms of Cosmos DB, the function app is going to use a key. Okay. And the web app, by the way, is also going to use a key for the function app. Well, those keys represent sensitive information. So rather than having them embedded directly in the web app or even in the configuration, I'm storing those keys in a key vault. Now, the really cool thing about storing those in the key vault is the way I've defined my applications. It's completely agnostic to the application. So as far as my applications are concerned, both of the function app and the web app, the keys that they're using are just configuration settings, right? But what I'm doing is I'm going to redirect those configuration settings in Azure to Key Vault so I can better manage that secret information. Okay, so that is the architecture. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start out with Azure. Now, I've got my Azure Portal. If you've ever been in Azure for 5 minutes, you've probably seen the Azure Portal. I've got a dashboard set up, and I have 2 resource groups. And you don't even really need to care about that. It's just everything you create in Azure is a resource, and it goes into a resource group. I've got one that's already done. That's my cooking show demo. And I've got another resource group where I'm going to go right now, and I'm going to create some things. So I'm going to start out with the database layer. Okay, so let's say that I need a couple of different resources for this overall architecture, right? I need a SQL database and I need a Cosmos DB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just type in SQL database, and I'm going to select SQL database. And then I'm going to pull up SQL database, and I'm going to create it. So I just sort of click through and said, okay, I need to create these things. Now, I need to tell this database where I'm going to put it, right? And that's just, I'm going to put in this webinar live. Okay, I need to give the database a name, and we'll just call it webinar. All right. Now, the database needs to be hosted in a server, and there are a variety of ways that you can do this. I'm going to create a new server. All right. Well, there's kind of one way you can create a server. There's a lot of options for the server. Okay. And on the server, I am going to give this a name, INE live webinar. Oh, what I just said was not entirely true. And then the options here are very simple. Sorry, I was thinking ahead. So I need to say, okay, that's going to be the endpoint for the server. I need to give it some authentication so that I can get into the server as necessary. And I need to put the server somewhere. So I'm going to put it in East US. So when I create the database has to be hosted in a server. So I need to create both. Now, if you're using some of the other techniques, it's really a little bit different. You kind of create the server, and then you can go in and create databases. Doesn't really matter. All right. One of the things that's important is defining, and this is always going to be the truth, and one of the key things you're going to do with any platform service is figure out how much performance you want, what features you want, and how much you want to pay for it. Okay. So I'm going to go in here to compute plus storage. And it wants me to start out with what's called a managed instance. And the managed instance that it wants me to start out with is $380 a month for certain functionality, 2 virtual cores and 32 gigabytes of storage. However, I don't need all that. So I'm going to go over here and create something that's basic. That's only going to cost me $5 a month. It's not going to give me a lot of performance, but that's fine. All right, and that's it. So those are all the settings, and I hit review and create, and then I create, and within about 2 minutes, I'm gonna have a fully functioning SQL Server database hosted by Microsoft that I can connect to and work with the way I would any other SQL database. I'm gonna actually show you that as well. All right, now, in addition to that SQL database, which is deploying, I've also decided that I need a Cosmos DB database. So I'm gonna go in and set up a Cosmos DB database. So go in here and say, okay, Cosmos DB, I'm going to put this in that webinar live. Okay, now I need to give this a unique name. All right, then the API, I mentioned there's a number of different APIs. So there's Core, there's MongoDB, Cassandra, Azure Table, Gremlin. There are others, but these are the ones that I can get to and create through the portal. I'm going to say I want Core. Okay, there are some other things I can choose. Okay, but I don't necessarily want to. Account type, it's going to be non-production. You can have geo redundancy. You can. This is a global service, very powerful. Also, by the way, kind of expensive, but I'm going to go ahead and create it anyways because it's INE's money, not mine. Okay. All right, and create. All right, so now I've gone through the process, and that's it. Once those 2 things are spun up, a couple minutes, I will have my back end, right? Now, the next thing I want to do is I need a function app, and I need a web app. So kind of the same process. Go ahead and create a resource. And there's a function app right there. Create a function app. And I'm going to put this in webinar live. Have to give this a name. All right, and this is going to be code-based. By the way, I can also do this Docker container-based. Love container-based stuff, but we're not going to do that right here. Okay, and runtime stack. I'm going to run this in .NET Core. Notice there are other stacks I can use as well. And what version? That's fine. Region. Put everything in East US. hosting, it needs a storage account. It's going to create that. Windows or Linux, I'm going to leave it in Windows, and I want this to be consumption plan type. And basically what that means is I'm not paying for capacity, I'm paying for usage. And Microsoft is going to automatically scale this to meet whatever usage requirements there are, which is pretty cool stuff. And by the way, I also often go and use Linux. It's just kind of clicking through, frankly, using Windows. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and create that and create. All right, so now 3 out of the 4 components I've already created. So I have provisioned or created the relational database, I've provisioned my non-relational database, and I've provisioned my function app. Now, well, there's 2 more parts. One is a web app, the other is Key Vault. Okay, and to provision the web app, well, I'm gonna go up here and say create a resource and pick web app. And same thing, get the idea. It's probably getting a little bit boring here. So I'll go through this, has to have a name. All right, I need live web app. And notice there's actually quite a number of different platforms I can host this on. I'm kind of, again, .NET Core person, so we'll go there. We're going to put this also in East US. It's going to have a plan. I can set the scale that I want. I'm fine with that scale. And oh, also, by the way, it's going to be Windows. And so I review and create this. And again, very simple. I now have 4 major components for hosting this workload, this web application, right? I've got my relational database, I've got my Cosmos DB, I've got my function app, I've got my web app. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go about the process of actually defining, while those kind of all percolate in the background, so we're not wasting too much time. All right, well, okay, that's good. How would I go about building a solution for this? Okay, now I'm a .NET person, I'm a Visual Studio person. It's the tool I'm going to use because it makes things ridiculously simple. Okay, note that there are software development kits or SDKs and libraries for a wide range of platforms that you can create both function apps and web apps, and frankly that you can use to connect to Cosmos DB or an Azure SQL database. Okay. What I'm going to do though, if I was going to build this out, is I'm going to go into Visual Studio. And I've got Visual Studio 2019. I use a lot of Visual Studio code, but frankly, in terms of sort of letting me cheat, Visual Studio still has slightly better tooling for some of the Azure capabilities, particularly Azure functions. And again, that's more a matter of familiarity for me, really. And I didn't want you to have to, kind of get caught up on me taking too long on something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new coding project. And I am going to create an Azure function project. All right, and we are going to give this project a name of live webinar fun. Okay, put it where it wants it to go, and that's fine. Now it's going to say, okay, you're creating this function app. Function apps run independently. They're microservices, but they all have to be triggered somehow. Okay? And oftentimes what you want to use is an HTTP trigger. Now, I will tell you for this purpose, I am. My preference is actually somewhere around here, queue trigger. Much prefer using queues because it just gives me better asynchronous capabilities. But for this, as people think of microservices, they typically think of HTTP. So that's what I'm building, an HTTP trigger, and it's creating that project. All right, and it of course put it up out here. Now, what that does, just like any other development environment where you're using templates, okay, this generates a project based on a template. And what's pretty interesting is Here's the code. This is all the code that you have to care about. This is a function definition, okay? And really, the code that you would write would just go in here. And again, this is C# code. If you're not a C# person right now, don't worry too much about it. I'm going to go through and show you the actual code that I've got running and walk through that a little bit. But the point is, I haven't had to do anything yet, and this would actually work right off the bat, right? So it's kind of like a tutorial and a shell kind of all put together here. And then if I can find my Solution Explorer, there we go. I could add another function, right? So if I go right click that and say, I want to add a new Azure function, all right, I would give this a better name. Generally, it says, okay, you're adding an Azure function, fine. Okay. And then it's going to say, again, what type? Do I want another HTTP trigger, right? So am I defining a REST API, a microservice-based REST API? I could do that, or any other trigger. Let's say, okay, I want this to be triggered by Event Hub, which I literally just picked randomly. Okay, aside from the fact that these are absolutely horrible names, right? What it does is it generates out kind of the overhead that I need. Okay, and I've got this function right here, and it runs and it does something. And I obviously need to set things up and all that, but it's really fairly simple. The actual HTTP trigger is even simpler because I really don't have to set anything up. All right, so that's a function app. Okay, now the web app, in this case, again, because I'm using, C# and .NET and Visual Studio, I could go and add a new project, and I could say somewhere in here, web. There we go. I know there's web. There we go. All right, so I want to create an ASP.NET Core web application. Okay, so we've got a name there. This is all very terrible. And create that. All right, now what's really cool here, and the reason why I wanted to do this, and I'm not using this in the application that I developed, but I mentioned that you can set up identity and authentication and very easily integrate that into your application. And there's not that many additional requirements here. If you don't do it through the tools here, it's still not hard to do. But I can literally go, okay, I want to use worker school accounts, and I'm going to pull these from. It's looking up all of the Azure AD directories that I have. It says, okay, inedemo.onmicrosoft.com, perfect. And then create. Insufficient privileges. Ooh, interesting. I am not logged in as the right person. Normally, that works extremely well, right? And that's literally all I have to do. And then my application is leveraging Azure AD for authentication. Now, I can also do that very easily by just adding a few settings to an existing application. But let's change that back. There we go. I just need to see what it's using as my primary login there. I think I know. All right. In any case, I now have a function app and I have a web app, and I can start to code these. Okay. So we've looked at creating the underlying resources. I've looked at some tools I can use to create the actual code. Okay, again, I already have the actual code. Now what I want to do, and we're not going to go too deep into this, I just want to give you a feel for it. So it's okay, I'm hosting these things. Microsoft's hosting them for me. All right, I've got my database, I've got my non-relational data, I've got my web app, I've got my function app. I probably still want to be able to configure these at least a little bit. And you certainly have that without having the need to actually host, at the virtual machine level. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my dashboard, and then I'm going to go to my webinar live. This is my resource group where all of those resources I provisioned a few minutes ago now live. And for each one of these, I can go in and say, okay, here is my server. And again, I could take an hour going just through this. But the point is, I do have configuration. So for example, one of the things I like to do is set this up for Azure Active Directory connectivity. And so I could go in here and I could say, okay, I want to set the admin, and I want the admin to be me. T Wallace to find the right one. I believe that's who I'm logged in as. Okay. And it's okay. Oh, I know. It's being weird about that one. I can also set this up to be a group. There we go. I've got a group, SQL admins. So, okay, I want anyone who's in that group to be able to log in and administer this server and everything on the server. Okay, and so that's what that's doing, and it's good, it's set up. Okay, now another thing that I can do is if I go to firewalls and virtual networks, this thing is firewalled off, and I have a ton of options. I can deny public access. I can actually require minimal TLS version, how I want to connect, and I can also, for example, add my own client IP. And that's just, again, just one security thing. There's so many different things you can do here: scaling, protection, recovery, advanced security, lots of stuff you can do. Okay. All right. Now, you know, I also created a database, so I can go to my database, and in fact, I can even go into a query editor and connect up. And I've got a live view of my database here. And so I could write transact SQL, I could create things, whatever I need to do. Now, I wouldn't typically use this. It's just an example, right? So I'm up, I'm running. All right, now what about Cosmos DB? Okay, same kind of thing. So find my Cosmos DB. Did I not put it here? Oh, there it is right there. I'm actually on it. Had it grayed out because I was on it. Okay, so here is my Cosmos DB. Oh, Cosmos DB is still creating. So we'll see an actual Cosmos DB in a minute. You can see it's a bit grayed out, but there's a number of settings there as well. Okay, and that's going to be true for all of these different features, right? Including, of course, my web app and my function app. Now what I want to do is I'm going to change gears a little bit, and I'm going to go back and take a look at some code, okay, that's taking advantage of this. Actually, I'm sorry, before I do that, all right, one of the things that's pretty cool is in addition to you know, having kind of that web-based interface, you know, the tools you're used to using are still going to work with the host. I know it sounds like I'm selling, but to me as a dev, this is pretty cool stuff, right? So if you're a SQL Server person, you're probably familiar with SQL Server Management Studio. If you're a MySQL person, you may be familiar with MySQL Workbench. These tools work when you're connecting up to databases hosted in Azure, right? So I could go in through kind of my normal process, and hopefully it's going to come up right away, right? And it's probably a little hard to see, but that is the URL of the database I'm going to connect to. And I log in. That's not the one I just created. That is the one I created before. A question just came in, and it's a really important question. And by the way, I'm not going to be done by 12. Sorry, but it's one I want to answer right now because it's really timely. So first of all, great username King Joe. King Joe asked the question. Sorry if this was discussed earlier, but how do you add the virtual network VNet, and do you have to VPV here in this setup, or can be accessed by using any browser? What are you using to authenticate? All right, bit to unpack there, but this is the point of platform as a service. All right, I'm not dealing with the virtual network. It's there, but I'm not dealing with it. I'm not dealing with the virtual machine. Azure's handling all that. All I care about is hosting my workload, right? That's why I'm looking at platform as a service. So when I provision a web app, okay, that web app underneath of it, it has virtual machines running. They're in a virtual network, okay? But I'll tell you the answer to the second. I got a second question. It's got a great answer to it. But I don't have to deal with any of that. I didn't have to set it up. All right, and I'm interacting with the web app. I'm controlling the web app through an HTTPS TLS protected connection. Okay, that management layer that I talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, right? That is a REST API. Okay, when I'm going through the portal is actually riding on top of that REST API. You could write your own environment your own code to manage your resources. And there's also command line tools. But to answer that part of the question, to interact with the web app configuration, to interact with anything I have, that's all done through HTTPS. Okay, and all of this is done at the platform level, so I'm not worried about the VPN. The virtual machine, the virtual network connectivity, it's all handled for me. Now, hopefully that answers your question, King Joe. Great question. Second question from David Trashel. Was there a reason to put Cosmos DB in West region instead of East? Absolutely. And the reason is I forgot to set it to East US. So that was just a mistake on the part of your webinar host. Okay, now I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I have a tool. By the way, I'm not necessarily going to break flow for every question. I just thought that was exactly on time for what we were talking about here. It was a great time to ask it. All right, so I'm just going through it. This is just a tool. It doesn't matter what it does. But the point is I'm using this database tool exactly the same way I use it when I'm going against local. Now, to be fair, there are a few things. You always want to look at feature differences. There's, again, kind of a wide range of options you have, particularly with SQL Server. But, base functionality is going to be the same. And honestly, I look at the SQL Server solutions that back when I used to have a real job and used to develop applications for a living, and this is pre-cloud because I'm old, I think about the SQL Server solutions, and there is not one production database that I put out there that required features that were not available in an Azure SQL database, right? That is something you need to understand, though. That is something you need to look at when you're making this decision, is you have to look at the feature list and say, okay, yeah, this actually is feature compatible. It's the right version. It's going to work for what we're doing. But that's true, really, even if you just think about versions that might be differentiated with a single platform that's running directly on a virtual machine. All right, now, so it's connectivity, that's tools. So I've got my platform set up. I've got tools. I know I can configure my platform. What about accessing this stuff? Well, as I mentioned, I've already got the code, so you're not going to watch me bang out a bunch of code. Okay. And hopefully that is it. Yes, that is it. Sure, we'll save that. Okay, so what I have is I actually have 3 different applications here, 3 different projects. And again, you don't have to be a .NET person. You don't have to be a Visual Studio person, right? This is just the platform that I use for the demonstration. But I've got 3 different applications. One of them we're not really going to do anything with, and that was just used to load up some data into Cosmos DB. All right, so I actually took some data from some of my courses where I've got some data in a database that defines a course and what tasks are associated with the course. And then in Cosmos DB, I have the actual content of the tasks, that the hands-on activities for those courses, right? And so this just was something I used to load that up. Okay, I've got a function app, and that really, the function app is what is of particular interest, okay? Because that's really where all the heavy lifting is done. And I'm going to just go ahead and take a look at a couple of these. Okay, here is a function, get course list. And what this does is this connects up to an Azure SQL database, the same thing as I just created. And it retrieves, very simply, a list of courses, okay? And returns that as just a set of just a JSON object. All right, now you can see all the code here. The only thing that's missing from this is it's going to return a particular object, okay? But everything else, all the code for this is here, okay? Now, in terms of, code that I wrote, okay, right? That's the code that I wrote. All of this header stuff was generated for me. And whatever SDK, whatever libraries you're using, there's obviously documentation for integrating with that. But what I particularly like is in terms of connectivity to SQL Server, the only thing that differentiates, and you don't even have to do this, but the only thing that differentiates the fact that I'm using an Azure SQL database from, say, connecting up to a database that's on premises running on a virtual machine is this line right here, one line. Okay, what that line does is it does use a service. I had to add in a package, and there's Node.js packages, Python packages, cross PHP certainly, and others that says, okay, I want to authenticate against Azure AD, and I want to generate an access token, okay, an identity token that can be used to authenticate when I make requests to my database, my SQL database, right? And that way, the SQL database is pulling a connection. And I've got, if I can find it here, there we go. Oh, useful if I remember that I was on screen draw there. There we go, that should work a little bit better. All right, now I have a database connection, and that's this right here. But what you'll see is in this database connection, I don't have any sensitive data. I don't have a user account name. I don't have a password. Okay? That's because of the fact that I'm using Azure AD for authentication. And again, that's all that extra line did. Okay? Is it set me up for Azure authentication. Everything else is just standard accessing SQL database. Okay, so if you're accessing Oracle, all right, maybe you're going to have a connection string with some secret sensitive data in it, but I'll also show you how you can protect that. But in this case, I don't even have to do that. Now, for Cosmos DB, the connectivity to that, and again, I'm not going to go too much into this. Okay, now I will tell you, this is all code that is specific to Cosmos DB because that's where I'm hosting my non-relational, my document-based information. This would be very analogous to if you're using MongoDB, you'd have MongoDB code to interact with that. All right, and again, that could be hosted directly in a Cosmos DB database or other options as well. Okay, but so I've got some code here. Now, one thing is the way Cosmos DB authenticates, it doesn't yet use managed identities, right? Instead, I do have to have a key. And that key is, unfortunately, right now stored as a setting. So it's kind of in plain text, right? Now, it's not going to deploy the way I have it set up. It's not going to deploy up into my function, okay? Now, other than that, the only thing that is of particular interest is in the web app. If I go down to the code for the web app, and again, if you're not a .NET person, if you're not an ASP.NET Core person, you don't care about the details of this, okay? What I'm going to show you is how I use that function app. And if I can find it, there's my controllers. Got a controller. Okay, so this is where, frankly, all of the code of interest is. And it's actually pretty simple. I have 3 different functions: get courses, get task list, get task detail. They all go down to this one function, call function. And all this function does is it generates a REST API request, okay? And it's either going to be a GET request or a POST request, depending on the function app itself and what it's expecting, okay? But, again, this is all really just this whole code, everything that's in the web app itself is really just using a REST API, nothing to do with Azure. It's just that's how the function apps are implemented. Now, with the function app, as with Cosmos DB, I'm going to secure that with a key. And as with Cosmos DB, okay, right now, my key is plain text embedded. Now, if you are planning on hacking either my function apps or my Cosmos DB, you've got, maybe half an hour until I'm done with this particular demo, and I'm blowing it all away. So have at it, I guess, now that you've seen it. Please don't, though, in all honesty. Okay, so that's all the code, right? And the point here, and I know I whipped through that code fairly quickly. If anybody wants that code, just reach out to me. Oh, I didn't give you any of my connection information. I'll put that in the chat. But you can twallace@ine.com. I'll send this. Actually, what I'll probably end up doing, and hopefully our intrepid digital marketing person is still online, Brittany, I'll probably upload a zip file and just give you the link that maybe you can throw out in the email that you send out if that'll work out for you. Oh, and look at that. Brittany's already given you my email address. I'm also, I think it's Tracy Wallace INE is my handle at Twitter. And Brittany also knows that better than I do. So there you go. I knew I could get you to do that. Anyways, so by the way, feel free to ask any questions. I will be happy to revisit that code. Okay, and I'll be happy to do it during this, or communicate afterwards is fine. But again, here's the key things. Okay, I've got this thing called a function app. I've got tooling that makes it really easy to define the function app. In my case, it's Visual Studio. Okay, and then as far again as interacting with a platform resource, SQL database, the only thing that really differentiates this from any other code I would write is the fact that I'm using Azure AD, and I've got one line that does that. Okay, now I've deployed both of these, and we're going to switch over to that and take a look at what we've got. First, however, I'm going to take a sip of coffee. All right, so I've got all of this deployed out, and it's exactly what I've shown you there, but we're going to go to my webinar here. Okay, and I can show you in my Cosmos DB. I could find Cosmos DB. There's my Cosmos DB. Okay, it's got a data explorer. It's got tools. Okay, and I can go in here, and I can do things like, okay, I've got data in here. I can actually look at that data. I can pull it up, and here's information. And the information itself doesn't matter, right? If you've ever used a database system, you probably have a tool that lets you interact with it. This is a built-in tool that lets me interact with my Cosmos DB data. Okay, but I can do that. I can actually upload data. Again, in my case, I wrote a quick little utility app that pulled in a bunch of data and set things up. Okay, so that's my Cosmos DB data. Okay, I've got a SQL database. Okay, around here somewhere. There we go. There's my SQL database. Okay, tons of different settings for this. Talked about that already, but it's up and running. And literally, I didn't have to do anything, right, with this other than just interact in the same way I would. I've got a script that generates the database and populates the database. And so I just opened up SQL Server Management Studio and I ran that script. Simple. Okay. Other than that, I mean, I really didn't have to do anything with this database. I have a function app, and this is where it gets a little more interesting. Here's the function app. Now, that function app has 3 deployed functions. So it's 3 functions I just talked about: get courses, get task detail, get task list. So I have those. Okay. Also, I set this function up, and actually now it's the default, which is nice. All right. So this function has its own identity. Okay. So it's got what's called a managed identity. All right. And that's important because I actually put that identity in an Active Directory, an Azure AD group. Okay, you saw that SQL admins group. There's the SQL admins group. There's the members. And that INE webinar that I've got kind of highlighted, that actually is the identity for my function app. Now, this is a terrible way to do it because I'm giving that function app full administrative rights. Even though the function app code is clean, I don't like doing that. I would much rather have it as a SQL user, but again, that's just a topic that's outside of what I think we need to talk about. All right, but I've got the user, and by the way, that user was generated automatically. Okay, the only thing I did was I created a group in Azure AD, which you could literally go into Azure AD and figure out how to create a group without any training. Although we do have lots of training on it, I'd love for you to take it. But and it's pretty easy to put a member in a group. Okay, so that was all very straightforward, and I literally did exactly the same thing in this SQL Server that I did with the other one, where I went in and I added that group as the Azure AD administrator for the server. Okay, and I added my local IP or my IP address into the firewall so I could connect up to it. All right. Now, one other thing on the function app, okay, and that is, and I can never find this. Okay, let's go. Oh, that's because I went to that's because I went to the wrong thing. All right, here's my function app. Now, if you recall, when I was showing you the code, the function app requires a key for Cosmos DB. Okay? And that key could be considered sensitive information. Right? Now, I have that set up in a configuration. And the way that I end up using that safely here is if I open up my configuration, I actually have that setting right here, Cosmos DB key. It might be a little bit hard to see, okay? But whereas, you know, when I'm working with this locally, okay, and if I come over here locally and I go to my local settings.json, right, I have the actual key here. Now I could literally take this key value and just drop it directly in that configuration for my function app. So I could actually go in here and say, okay, there's Cosmos DB, and I could put that key right here. Instead, I have, and in fact, this might be a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to take that and put it in Notepad so you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so what I've done, making absolutely no changes to the application itself, is I've said, look, I don't want to keep that key in the configuration for the application, so I'm going to put a little bit of syntax in here. And what this does is this tells my application to look for this value in a key vault secret. And I give it the full path, the unique identifier, the URI of that secret. And that way, rather than having that information here like I have it on my local machine, okay, it's in a more secure environment. And what's really cool is this is completely transparent to the application itself. I'm not changing any code. And even if you're not using .NET, if you, for example, have, let's say you're using a Python app or Node.js app and it's using environment variables, that's actually how this works. It sets environment variables. Okay? And so it gets picked up as an environment variable. .NET is cool with that. .NET Core is cool with that. Most of your systems are cool with that. But I also have the advantage of saying, hey, I can really secure this data, which is, I think, pretty awesome. Okay, and then I actually have, well, here, we'll cancel that. We'll leave that up for a minute. All right, and so really, again, there's other things I can do to configure this. But I also want to let you know that other than adding the identity of the function app to my Azure AD group and actually deploying the code, which I can do from Visual Studio simply by deploying. You can also, by the way, set up a wide range of DevOps pipeline systems. Jenkins works, GitHub works, Azure DevOps works, as well as others. So I could actually have code that's automatically pushed here when people check it in and goes through the pipeline. If you're a DevOps person, that probably makes you happy. If not, you just glaze over that. Okay, but in any case, I've had to do almost nothing in terms of customizing code to work in the Azure environment or really hosting it, right? I'm not dealing with the virtual machine, the virtual network, the platform, whether it's IIS or Apache or Nginx or anything else. I'm just saying, look, here's some code, let me throw it in. I will tell you, didn't want to do it here because I think it adds something that you don't necessarily need. When I'm doing this, generally speaking, what I'm actually doing is generating containers, generating container images. And that way, I can deploy that. And there's, like I said, tons of capabilities for containers at the platform level as well, including, by the way, pushing containers to function apps and web apps. So I could actually have this as a container and have the container in a function app so that if I decide I want to host it somewhere else, I'm not tied. So lots of flexibility there. Okay, last thing, and we're almost to the payoff. I'm only 20 minutes late. All right, here's my web app. Now, similar thing with the web app. Oh, nope, that's Cosmos DB. I know how to do this, really. There's my web app. Okay, similar to my function app. The web app needs to connect to the function app, and to do that, it needs a function key. But again, the same thing, rather than actually putting the function key right here, which by the way is encrypted, but I just like as much separation as I logically can get. Okay, if I put it in here, it's almost the same. I mean, it's exact same structure. It's just a different secret that I'm pointing to, right? One's pointing to Cosmos DB key, the other's pointing to function key, which, to bring things full circle, if I go back, all right, so before I go here, so we've looked at Cosmos DB, we've looked at Azure SQL Database, we've looked at a function app, and we've looked at a web app, all of which I showed you how to deploy. As far as deploying code to them, from Visual Studio, it's literally right-click deploy, or right-click publish, and you can deploy, okay? And I mean, I know I can show you that at the end, but there's also tons of other ways to deploy code, including FTP, including uploading a zip file. Okay? And like I said, probably most commonly now, looking at it as the endpoint of a DevOps pipeline. All right, now I'm storing those secrets in Key Vault. So what is that? If you're not familiar, it's just a very well-controlled space, and it's encrypted. And in fact, you can actually encrypt it with your own keys. It can use a hardware security module for encryption. Lots of cool stuff. Okay, two things that matter. One, secrets. Notice I have two secrets here: Cosmos DB key and function key. Right, these are the two that I'm using, and I can go in and I can actually view that secret. Okay. Oh, I don't want to copy it. I'm going to view it. There we go. And that may be a little bit hard to see, so let me just, again, pull that out and copy it, which I'd already done, and bring up my handy-dandy, very technical notepad. Not even Notepad++, but that is my function key. That's exactly the same value that I have in that local configuration file. The local configuration file does not deploy up to the web. Okay? But that's how I'm getting it. And the same thing, whether it's this is the function key, the Cosmos DB key is the same thing. In the end, now for the anticlimactic part, putting it all together. This worked 10 minutes before I ran this webinar. Hopefully it's going to work again. All right. So here I am back in my web app. All right. I've deployed my code to my web app, exactly the code that I showed you. Now I browse it. And all right, that list that just popped up, and by the way, I am not a front-end developer, so this does not look pretty. Okay, that was not the point of this. Okay, and let's make it so you can see a little bit better. Okay, so you can see I have this list of courses. That list of courses is generated by making a call to my web API, which in turn makes a call to the function app, which in turn retrieves the data from the Azure SQL database. And if I click on one of these, then it returns the course details. So I see a description of the course, and I see a list of tasks that are associated with the course. And if I click on a task, that goes against Cosmos DB, and that pulls up the actual task requirement definition. Okay, so now all of this is going through this pipeline, right? The page comes up, the page goes, makes a call, and that call, oops, not there. That call goes to a function app. That function app makes a call to SQL Server using Azure AD for authentication, right? And then that data comes back through the function app, through the web app, back to the JavaScript in the browser, which can then make another call going to SQL Server again, right? And then eventually makes a call Cosmos DB to retrieve that details. Now, you may have noticed that there was a bit of delay there, a bit of lag. That actually has to do with the fact that A, I'm using everything on the super cheap, and B, the fact that it was the first time that function app had been called in a while, right? I just refreshed the page and it made that call again. Notice how fast that comes up. And I click there, notice that comes up very quickly. And I click there. So I wanted to show you that has to do with the way you use function apps. Function apps, you can actually get them so that they're not load on demand. The reason why that took a moment is because the function apps were all load on demand, and they only stay memory resident for about, I think it's 10 minutes if they're not used. But you can actually, if you take a higher priced function app, where you pay a certain baseline plus consumption that keeps that hot so you don't have that initial delay. But wasn't really that important for a webinar. But I think it is important to understand that, even though I am using these parts, even though I am, using all of these things really as hosted platform solutions, I'm not seeing degradation in the performance of my application. All right, and that's really kind of what I wanted to show you for part one. So there's a couple things that I just want to throw in there. One, I truly want to thank you for attending this. Hopefully you got something out of this. I'll be more than happy to, as I said, I'll put together a zip file with the application that I've got. It's completely not commented because like all developers, all of my code is self-documenting, so I don't need comments. Either that or I just didn't have time to and won't have time to. But again, I want to say thanks a lot for being here. If you have questions right now, if you want to take a look at any of the specifics of that code, I'll be happy to go over that now. Also, if you're not an INE customer, I'm going to plug a little bit here. Come over, take a look at us, INE.com. We've got a rich set of courses. I'm working, I will tell you, I don't have the Azure Dev courses up yet. That's my next my next endeavor here. But we do have a number of courses for Azure as well as other cloud platforms, Google Cloud Services and AWS. And we have, as it turns out, a bunch of networking, as that's kind of what we're known for, as well as if you are data scientists, we've got data science stuff, and we've got some really top-notch InfoSec. So thank you very much. Joe, many thanks. You said many thanks for your help. It is great. You're absolutely welcome. And now I'm going to just be quiet here and let you ask any questions. A question did come through on the chat from Damala. Hopefully I pronounced that right. The question is, please, how can I get a recording or a video of this whole webinar because I want to watch it again? I'll give you the very short answer, then I'll turn it over to Brittany. The answer is that if you are here, which if you're sending a chat message, you are here, you're going to get a web email. That's what it is. An email with a link to this recorded webinar. Brittany, do you want to flesh that out a little bit?
Yep. So yes, Tracy is correct. If you are watching from Zoom and you registered for this webinar, you'll get an email to the email address that you registered with later on this afternoon with the recording. If you're watching on Facebook via Facebook Live, we'll be posting that link later on our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, everywhere. Just so that you guys can get it as well. But yes, if you registered online and you're watching it via Zoom, you will get it sent directly to your inbox.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany. One other thing, I'm not seeing any other questions. Awesome. I'm glad to hear that, Christopher Johnson. Here's what I'm going to ask you. All right, I am doing another. This was part one. I plan on doing another Azure Dev webinar, but I haven't picked a topic yet, right? I wanted to give kind of that broad overview on this one. So here's your opportunity to ask for an hour of free training of interest to you. Reach out to me on Twitter. Follow me if you're not, because I'm begging for people to follow me. And I'll get my LinkedIn there for you, Demla. But just send me a message. What would you like to see maybe next month? If there's another Azure developer topic that you'd like to go through, I can pick one. But I would love, if I get some people that are interested in a particular topic, I'd love to dive into that for an hour. So that's it for me. Other than I'll go and grab my LinkedIn name. I didn't put that. Usually I put a slide in this. For whatever reason, I didn't put that slide in this presentation. So again, thank you all very much. If you want to hang out for that LinkedIn link, I'll send that to you momentarily. Otherwise, we are done.